The chamber beneath the crown. Beneath Alexandria's greatest palace, there were rooms no map recorded. What happened there was not meant for gods, nor for history to remember. The first thing ancient witnesses described was the air, heavy, sweet with incense, tainted with something metallic they could never quite name. Beneath Cleopatra's palace, carved into limestone older than the dynasty itself, lay chambers built long before Rome knew Egypt existed. These were not banquet halls or treasure vaults. They were places of ritual, secrecy, and control. Spaces where sound died quickly and light behaved strangely, bending across walls carved with gods in moments of transformation, birth, death, union, rebirth. Cleopatra VII did not enter these chambers as a queen. She entered as a symbol. Draped not in royal regalia, but in linen woven to resemble the garments of Isis, she understood something most rulers never learned. Authority does not only sit on thrones, it lives in belief, fear, expectation. The unseen pressure that makes witnesses obey even when no guards are present. To those summoned below the palace, priests, physicians, scribes, her presence alone altered reality. The rules of the surface world did not apply here. Official Roman histories would later insist these stories were exaggerations, Eastern fantasies meant to stain Cleopatra's name, yet fragments survived. Burned scrolls referenced indirectly, marginal notes by Greek physicians who refused to elaborate, temple records sealed and hidden, not erased. When sources from opposing sides all avoid the same details, historians learn to pay attention. Cleopatra had grown up surrounded by betrayal. The Ptolemaic court was not merely corrupt, it was instructional. Brothers married sisters to secure power. Fathers ordered daughters executed. Loyalty was temporary, morality negotiable. From childhood, Cleopatra observed one constant truth. Fear lasts longer than affection, and secrets bind more tightly than laws. She did not stumble into darkness, she studied it. Alexandria offered her tools no ruler before her possessed in such combination. The greatest library in the world, Greek rational medicine alongside Egyptian temple science, alchemy, astronomy, chemistry, theology. Where others saw contradictions, Cleopatra saw systems waiting to be merged. Religion could amplify authority. Ritual could reframe cruelty. Science could justify what conscience rejected. And secrecy, carefully engineered, could ensure silence. Those summoned to the underground chambers were never told the full purpose. That uncertainty was deliberate. Fear grows best when imagination fills the gaps. Witnesses were sworn to Isis before entering, reminded that blasphemy and treason carried punishments beyond death. The walls themselves reinforced the message. No windows, narrow ceilings, flickering oil lamps that created moving shadows, making even still figures appear alive. The mind, under such conditions, becomes malleable. Cleopatra observed everything: breathing patterns, hesitation, the way men avoided each other's eyes when confronted with something they could not name. She understood that people remember not what they see, but how they feel when they see it. And she was patient. She did not rush these moments. Tension was allowed to build, stretch, settle into the bones. Silence, she knew, was more effective than commands. Later Roman writers accused her of indulgence, excess, corruption. What they missed, or chose not to understand, was discipline. Nothing in those chambers was spontaneous. Every movement, every pause, every symbol served a function. Cleopatra did not seek pleasure for its own sake. She sought knowledge, control, the mapping of human response when stripped of certainty, status, and safety.
She wanted to know what happened when belief collided with fear, when authority wore the face of divinity. Some of the men who left those chambers never spoke of them again. Others rose rapidly in her service, bound not by reward, but by what they had witnessed. Shared secrets create a quiet prison. To reveal them would be to confess complicity. Cleopatra understood this perfectly. Loyalty enforced by silence does not require chains. Rome would later reduce her to caricature, the foreign queen, the dangerous woman, the temptress who ruined great men. It was easier than admitting a more unsettling possibility, that Cleopatra represented a form of power Rome did not control and could not publicly acknowledge. A ruler who understood that domination did not always require armies. Sometimes it required belief. Sometimes it required fear. Sometimes it required a single night underground that could never be explained to anyone who was not there. And yet, these chambers were only the beginning. The experiments conducted there were not isolated acts, but the foundation of a system Cleopatra refined over years. What began as ritual would evolve into something colder, more deliberate, and far more dangerous. Because the night the witnesses first descended beneath the palace, they believed they were observing a ceremony. They did not yet understand they were about to become part of it.
The girl raised by betrayal. Cleopatra didn't wake up one day and become feared. She was trained by a dynasty where love was a liability and mercy got you buried. Before the chamber beneath the palace, there was a childhood beneath a knife. Cleopatra was born into a family that treated blood like a bargaining chip. The Ptolemaic court in Alexandria glittered in public and rotted in private, a place where a smile could be a warning and a banquet could be a trap. This was not the kind of palace where children learned innocence. It was the kind where they learned patterns. Who vanished after arguing with the wrong advisor? Which servant stopped showing up? Which sibling's name was suddenly no longer spoken aloud? Cleopatra's earliest education was not philosophy, it was survival. Her father, Ptolemy XII, ruled Egypt like a man renting a kingdom. He paid Rome to keep his throne, taxed his people to fund those bribes, and fled when the city turned against him. Cleopatra watched the citizens of Alexandria rise in anger, watched power wobble, watched how quickly crowds could switch from worship to rage. Then she watched something colder. When her sister seized control in his absence and briefly proved competent, it did not matter. When her father returned with Roman support, he ended the challenge with finality. The message to Cleopatra was unmistakable. Competence does not protect you. Legitimacy does not protect you. Only force and the favor of those who command it keeps you breathing. But Cleopatra was not merely shaped by fear. She was shaped by access. Alexandria was not like other capitals. It was an engine of knowledge. The library's shadow fell over her youth like a second sun. Scholars argued in courtyards, physicians debated in shaded halls, mathematicians drew proofs that made reality seem negotiable. Cleopatra learned languages not as decoration, but as a weapon, a way to remove intermediaries who could twist meaning or leak secrets. She could speak directly to envoys, priests, merchants, and generals. In a world built on miscommunication and manipulation, clarity becomes power. And then there was the chemistry of it all, the ancient mixture of medicine, perfume making, mineral craft, and toxicology that blurred into one discipline. Cleopatra learned what most rulers would never study: how substances change when heated, ground, mixed, distilled; how a balm can soothe in one dose and harm in another; how a scent can alter mood; how a powder can brighten a face while quietly eroding the body over time. Beauty and danger shared a vocabulary in the ancient world. Cleopatra learned to speak it fluently.
The Romans would later frame this as decadence, but that is a convenient insult, not an explanation. Cleopatra's interest in formulas, compounds, and controlled effects was not a hobby, it was strategy. In royal courts, meals were risk, cosmetics were risk, medicine was risk. One careless servant, one bribed physician, one adulterated jar could end a reign without a single sword drawn. Cleopatra's response was to become difficult to poison because she understood poison, difficult to deceive because she understood how deception moved through systems. When you cannot trust your own household, you learn to audit reality itself.
When her father died, Cleopatra inherited a throne and a trap. The dynasty's tradition forced her into a ceremonial marriage with her young brother, a political arrangement presented as stability but designed to keep power predictable and controllable. Cleopatra refused to be controlled. For a brief period, she ruled with the confidence of someone who believes she can outthink the machine that raised her. Then the machine answered. Advisors rallied around the boy king, the palace shifted, guards changed loyalties, and Cleopatra was pushed out of Alexandria like an inconvenient fact. She fled, not in defeat, but in calculation, because she understood something her enemies underestimated. Exile is not the end if you can return with leverage. That leverage arrived wearing a Roman cloak. Julius Caesar came to Egypt chasing the remains of Rome's own civil war. Cleopatra's enemies made a catastrophic decision, thinking brutality would impress him. Instead, it signaled weakness and desperation, exactly the kind of disorder Caesar could exploit. Cleopatra moved quickly, slipping past barriers with a stagecraft that would become legend. She did not present herself as a frightened refugee, she presented herself as a solution. Egypt's wealth, Rome's hunger, Caesar's ambition, she aligned them in a single argument delivered with a calm that suggested she had rehearsed for this moment her entire life. The war that followed burned through Alexandria's streets and changed Cleopatra from a threatened queen into a ruler protected by Rome's most feared man. But that protection came with a price. Rome did not save clients out of kindness, it saved them to use them. Cleopatra understood she had purchased time, not freedom. If Caesar was her shield, he was also her chain, until she found a way to make the chain tighten around someone else instead. When she returned to full control, the palace transformed. Not visibly, not in the way common people could point to. The markets still opened, ships still unloaded grain, priests still led public ceremonies. But beneath the surface, Cleopatra began building something far more private than an army, a circle of knowledge and silence. She gathered people who were useful and vulnerable, physicians hungry for discovery, priests hungry for influence, officials hungry for proximity to power. She fed their ambition carefully, then sealed it with shared secrets they could never safely confess. And that is where the underground chambers return to the story. Because the first time Cleopatra ordered a private demonstration beneath the palace, she did not invite her enemies. She invited the kind of men who would later write history, treat bodies, interpret omens, men whose silence could protect her better than walls ever could. They believed they were being honored. They did not yet realize they were being selected. And as the torches dimmed and the stone door sealed behind them, one of the priests noticed something carved into the lintel, an old warning in sacred script that did not belong to Cleopatra's era at all. It didn't say enter, it said do not return unchanged.
When ritual became a weapon. They entered believing they were witnesses. They stayed because leaving was no longer an option. In Cleopatra's world, knowledge was never free. The underground chamber was never meant to feel neutral. Everything about it pressed inward, as if the stone itself were listening. The ceiling was deliberately low, forcing even tall men to bow their heads, an unconscious gesture of submission repeated before a single word was spoken. The lamps were placed unevenly, creating pockets of shadow that distorted distance and depth. Faces appeared closer than they were.
Movements seemed slower, heavier. Cleopatra understood environment the way generals understood terrain. Before anyone spoke, the room had already begun its work. The men she selected were not random. A Greek physician trained in rational medicine, proud of his discipline. 2 senior Egyptian priests whose authority came from tradition rather than innovation. A scribe whose job was to remember correctly. Each represented a different way of understanding reality. Cleopatra wanted them all present because she was not performing for belief alone. She was testing how belief fractures when confronted with uncertainty. She did not begin with commands, she began with questions, calm, precise, delivered in flawless Greek and ancient Egyptian. What do you consider sacred? Where does law end and divine exception begin? Can suffering be justified if knowledge is gained? The men answered cautiously, offering safe traditional responses. Cleopatra listened without reaction. She was not debating, she was measuring. People reveal their limits when they explain them. Only then did the ritual begin. It did not resemble the dramatic ceremonies Romans later imagined. There was no frenzy, no chaos. That restraint was intentional. Cleopatra understood that fear grows sharper in quiet. Chants were low, repetitive, old enough that even the priests had to concentrate to follow them. Symbols were introduced slowly, each with layered meaning, some religious, some medical, some purely psychological. The men began to realize they were standing at the intersection of disciplines that were never meant to meet. What unsettled them most was Cleopatra's manner. She showed no excitement, no cruelty, no hesitation. Her voice remained steady, almost instructional. This was not indulgence, this was procedure. The physician noticed it first. He had seen this focus before in surgical theaters, when a healer distances himself emotionally to preserve precision. But this was not healing. That contradiction lodged in his mind and refused to leave. Cleopatra explained what she was doing as one might explain a theory. She spoke of thresholds, how the body responds when certainty is removed, how the mind behaves when authority cannot be questioned, how sensation alters when expectation collapses. She referenced earlier observations, past trials never described in full. The implication was clear. This was not the first time. The chamber had a memory.
The witnesses began to understand their true role. They were not there to judge, they were there to validate. Their presence created legitimacy. If priests observed, it could be framed as ritual. If a physician observed, it could be framed as research. If a scribe observed, it could be framed as record. Cleopatra was constructing a structure in which no single discipline could claim responsibility alone. Guilt, like authority, would be shared. As the hours passed, the chamber did what it was designed to do. Time blurred. The men stopped thinking in terms of minutes and began thinking in terms of phases. Anticipation replaced outrage. Curiosity fought revulsion. None of them spoke up, not because they agreed, but because interruption felt dangerous. Cleopatra did not need guards. Silence enforced itself. At one point, the physician realized his hands were trembling, not from fear alone, but from fascination. He was seeing responses that challenged accepted models of the body and mind, observations that could reshape understanding if they had been gathered anywhere else, under any other authority. That realization terrified him more than the ritual itself, because it meant part of him wanted to keep watching. Cleopatra noticed. She always noticed. This was her true skill, not seduction as Roman writers later claimed, but exposure. She revealed to people the parts of themselves they preferred not to acknowledge. The priest who believed obedience was virtue learned how easily ritual could excuse harm.
The physician, who believed knowledge was neutral, learned how eagerly curiosity could override conscience. The scribe, who believed records preserved truth, learned how selectively truth survives. When the ritual ended, there was no release, no dramatic conclusion. Cleopatra dismissed them as if concluding a lesson. She reminded them of their oaths, not as threats, but as facts. Speaking would not only end their lives, it would invalidate their identities. They would be heretics, traitors, unreliable men whose words could be dismissed as madness or self-interest. She had given them knowledge and taken away their ability to use it freely. They left the chamber changed, though none of them could explain how. Above ground, Alexandria continued as normal. Markets opened, ships arrived. Children played near fountains fed by aqueducts older than Nemery. The contrast was unbearable. The physician wrote that night, but destroyed the papyrus before dawn. The priest prayed and felt nothing. The scribe began emitting details from unrelated records, unsure when he had learned to do that. Cleopatra, meanwhile, reviewed her conclusions. The ritual had worked, but it was incomplete. She had confirmed what she suspected. Belief amplifies authority, secrecy enforces loyalty, and controlled transgression binds more tightly than fear alone. But she also saw something else, a variable she had not fully explored, the effect of desire, not as pleasure, but as vulnerability, the way anticipation reshaped obedience, the way attention lingered. She began planning the next phase. Because the chamber beneath the palace was no longer just a place of ritual, it was becoming a laboratory. And the next time the doors closed, the witnesses would not be men who thought they were untouchable by power. They would be men who believed power belonged to them.
Rome's greatest lie. History called her a seductress to make her smaller. Rome needed a scandal because the truth was more dangerous. What terrified them was not her body, but her method. Rome explained Cleopatra in the only language it trusted, accusation. When news of her influence spread, senators did not debate policy or strategy, they debated morality. They whispered about Eastern excess, foreign rituals, and a queen who had enslaved great Roman men. It was a familiar tactic. If a threat cannot be defeated, it can be discredited. If power cannot be explained, it can be sexualized and dismissed. Cleopatra became a story Rome could control, so long as it ignored how control was actually achieved. The Roman elite were deeply uncomfortable with what they could not categorize. Cleopatra did not behave like a client queen. She did not beg. She did not flatter publicly. She did not apologize for influence. Instead, she restructured the environment around powerful men until they found themselves reacting rather than commanding. That inversion terrified Rome more than any imagined decadence. An empire built on hierarchy cannot tolerate a system where hierarchy becomes invisible. Cleopatra's approach was subtle. She did not challenge Roman authority directly. She reframed it. In her presence, generals felt seen rather than obeyed. Senators felt included rather than opposed. Decisions that should have been transactions became conversations, and conversations became commitments. Rome mistook this for charm because it did not understand psychological leverage. Cleopatra never needed to dominate openly. She allowed others to believe they were acting freely until they realized how much they had already conceded. This was especially clear in her relationships with Rome's most powerful men. Julius Caesar was not conquered by desire, as Roman gossip insisted. He was confronted with competence. Cleopatra spoke to him as an equal, in his own language, with an understanding of Roman law, politics, and ambition that surprised him. She did not ask for mercy, she offered alignment, Egypt's wealth, stability in the East, a partner who understood theater as well as governance. Caesar did not protect Cleopatra because he was bewitched. He protected her because she made strategic sense. That distinction mattered, and Rome refused to acknowledge it. After Caesar's death, the pattern repeated with Mark Antony, but on a grander scale. Cleopatra did not meet him on Roman terms. She controlled the setting,
the timing, the narrative. Every sense was engaged deliberately, not to overwhelm, but to disorient. Antony arrived expecting obedience. He encountered spectacle designed to reset expectations. Rome later called it indulgence. In reality, it was negotiation conducted on terrain Cleopatra had prepared in advance.
Roman writers focused obsessively on banquets, perfumes, costumes. They described excess because it was easier than describing systems. Cleopatra's gatherings were not parties, they were laboratories of attention. She varied environment constantly to prevent acclimatization. She mixed intellect with pleasure, ritual with politics, novelty with familiarity. People cannot resist what they cannot predict. Antony did not lose himself to luxury, he lost certainty, and in that uncertainty, Cleopatra gained leverage. Behind closed doors, the same principles refined beneath the palace were applied at scale. Shared secrets, controlled disclosure, invitations that felt like honor but functioned as selection. Cleopatra allowed men to witness things they could not easily describe to others, moments that sat uncomfortably between sacred, private, and political. Rome later called these rumors of impropriety, but what they truly represented was bonding through ambiguity. Once you share an experience that defies public explanation, you belong to the person who curated it. The Roman establishment could not openly accuse Cleopatra of intellectual domination, so it accused her of moral corruption instead. She was portrayed as unnatural, foreign, excessive, everything Rome feared becoming if it acknowledged her effectiveness. Even historians sympathetic to Rome adopted the language, enchantress, temptress, witch, words that explain nothing but reassure the speaker. Yet fragments survived that told a different story, letters hinting at admiration rather than shame, records of policy decisions shaped in Alexandria, accounts of Roman officers who left Egypt changed, not weakened but reoriented. Cleopatra did not drain Rome's strength, she redirected it, and redirection is harder to detect than attack. What Rome truly feared was precedent. If Cleopatra's methods were acknowledged, they could be replicated. Power would no longer belong solely to armies and laws, but to those who understood perception, environment, and human response. An empire built on visible force cannot survive invisible influence. So Rome rewrote the narrative. Cleopatra became a cautionary tale instead of a case study. Her intelligence was reframed as manipulation, her strategy as excess, her control as seduction. By the time Augustus consolidated power, the story was fixed. Egypt's queen had fallen because she was immoral. Rome had triumphed because it was disciplined. But the truth lingered uncomfortably beneath the official version. Cleopatra had not lost because her methods failed. She lost because Rome eventually learned to imitate them, stripping away the ritual, the symbolism, the visibility, and keeping only the control. Her greatest mistake was not excess, it was being first. And as Rome prepared to erase her from acceptable memory, Cleopatra prepared something else. Because if history was going to turn her into a monster, she would decide what kind of monster they remembered. And the final act she planned would force Rome to confront a truth it could never fully suppress.
Desire as an instrument of power. Pleasure was never the goal. It was the pressure point. Those who mistook desire for weakness never saw the trap close. By the time Rome understood Cleopatra could not be reduced to scandal, it was already too late. Her system was complete. What began beneath the palace as ritual and observation had evolved into a method, precise, repeatable, devastatingly effective. Cleopatra did not rule by indulgence, she ruled by calibration. Desire, fear, belief, and reward were not emotions to her, they were variables. She understood something few rulers ever articulate. People obey more willingly when they believe they have chosen to do so. Desire creates that illusion. It invites participation. It lowers defenses.
It convinces the mind it is moving towards something it wants, even as the path narrows behind it. Cleopatra never forced intimacy, political or otherwise. She curated it. Those invited closer felt selected, elevated, essential. And by the time they realized the cost of proximity, retreat was unthinkable. This applied not only to Roman generals, but to Egyptian elites, priests, scholars, and administrators. Cleopatra created layers of access. Public audiences satisfied protocol. Private councils rewarded loyalty. Inner gatherings offered something rarer, belonging. Each layer came with knowledge the previous did not possess. Information became currency, silence became insurance, and desire, the desire to remain inside, did the rest. Her banquets were legendary not because of excess, but because of control. Cleopatra varied rhythm deliberately. One night, intellectual intensity, the next, sensory immersion, the next, solemn ritual. Patterns create comfort, variation creates dependence. Guests never knew what to expect, only that absence would mean missing something unforgettable. In this way, Cleopatra made herself irreplaceable, not as a lover, not as a queen, but as an experience. Those closest to her began to change in subtle ways. Roman officers adopted Egyptian customs without noticing. Advisors began defending policies they had once resisted. Language shifted. Decisions framed as mutual benefit increasingly favored Egypt. Cleopatra did not argue aggressively. She reframed context until agreement felt natural. When resistance appeared, she withdrew warmth, not punitively, but quietly. The absence was more persuasive than confrontation. Desire also served another function. It fragmented opposition. Men who might have aligned against her instead competed for proximity. Cleopatra never promised exclusivity. She offered possibility. That ambiguity ensured rivalry remained horizontal, never vertical. Power struggles turned inward rather than toward her. She stood at the center while others circled. Rome, watching from a distance, mistook this for decadence. Senators mocked Antony for forgetting himself in Alexandria, for dressing differently, speaking differently, thinking differently. What they failed to grasp was that Antony had not lost himself. He had entered a system where identity was being reshaped deliberately. Cleopatra did not strip away Roman values. She layered Egyptian ones alongside them until certainty dissolved. Yet no system is without cost. Cleopatra's methods demanded constant attention. Control built on perception requires maintenance. The moment spectacle fades, reality returns. As Rome stabilized under Octavian, pressure increased, alliances hardened, neutrality vanished. Cleopatra's influence, once subtle, became visible, and visibility is dangerous. The same techniques that had bound loyalty now drew suspicion.
Inside Alexandria, the atmosphere shifted. The underground chambers were used less frequently, not abandoned, but refined. Cleopatra had learned enough. Her circle was loyal, but loyalty under siege behaves differently. She began testing contingency, how people respond when safety collapses, when belief is challenged, when the future narrows. She watched who hesitated, who questioned, who stayed silent. Mark Antony's position weakened. His confidence, once bolstered by Cleopatra's presence, now collided with Roman expectations he could no longer satisfy. Choices that once felt inevitable now carried consequences. Cleopatra saw the pattern early. She always did. Desire, she knew, could not hold against despair. When hope fractures, control must transform. She began preparing for an ending, not surrender, but authorship. Cleopatra had spent her life shaping narratives before others could impose them. Now she faced an empire determined to define her. Rome would not allow her to be remembered as a strategist. It needed a cautionary tale. Cleopatra accepted this, but on her terms. If she was to become a symbol, she would choose the symbol's final shape. Her last months were not frantic, they were precise.
Records suggest fewer appearances, tighter circles, more silence. The palace became quieter, rituals grew simpler, messages were measured. Cleopatra was not clinging to power, she was consolidating meaning. She understood that defeat could erase authority, but not legacy. The people closest to her sensed it. Conversations changed tone. Invitations became rarer and more significant. Cleopatra was selecting witnesses one final time, not to a ritual, not to a banquet, but to history itself. Those allowed near her now were not being rewarded, they were being entrusted. Rome prepared its triumph. Cleopatra prepared her final performance. And as Octavian's forces closed in, she made a decision that would deny Rome its greatest victory, not her death, but her humiliation. Because Cleopatra knew something Rome still underestimated. Control does not end when power is lost. Sometimes it begins there.
The last performance. Rome came for a body. Cleopatra offered a meaning. History remembers who controls the ending. When Octavian's victory became inevitable, Cleopatra did not panic. Panic belongs to those who believe power exists only in armies and borders. Cleopatra had spent her life proving otherwise. She understood that conquest can seize territory, but it cannot easily seize narrative, and narrative, once fixed, outlives empires. The palace in Alexandria grew quiet in those final days, not abandoned, not chaotic, controlled. Cleopatra reduced her circle to a few trusted witnesses, not advisors but custodians. She dismissed the unnecessary, rewarded the loyal, and sealed records with instructions that ensured survival through silence. Rome would burn what it could find, but fragments endure when people know what must not be spoken aloud. Octavian's victory became inevitable. Cleopatra did not panic. Panic belongs to those who believe power exists only in armies and borders. Cleopatra had spent her life proving otherwise. She understood that conquest can seize territory, but it cannot easily seize narrative, and narrative, once fixed, outlives empires. The palace in Alexandria grew quiet in those final days, not abandoned, not chaotic, controlled. Cleopatra reduced her circle to a few trusted witnesses, not advisors but custodians. She dismissed the unnecessary, rewarded the loyal, and sealed records with instructions that ensured survival through silence. Rome would burn what it could find, but fragments endure when people know what must not be spoken aloud. Octavian wanted spectacle. A defeated queen paraded through Rome would confirm the moral story the empire had been telling itself for years. Discipline triumphs over decadence, order over chaos, Rome over the dangerous foreign woman who dared to play its game. Cleopatra understood this perfectly. She also understood that being seen alive in chains would erase everything she had built. The performance had to end on her terms. Ancient sources describe her final days with contradiction, and contradiction is where truth often hides. Some say she negotiated desperately. Others say she tested poisons one last time. What remains consistent is her calm. Cleopatra prepared her death the way she prepared everything else, deliberately. She dressed carefully. She arranged the setting. She ensured witnesses would remember not fear, but composure. This was not escape, it was authorship. The manner of her death has been debated for 2,000 years. The asp, the poison, the ritual gesture. The details matter less than the message. Cleopatra denied Rome the image it craved. No public humiliation, no triumphant procession, no broken queen. Instead, Rome received a body without a performance, and silence where it expected submission. Octavian, furious, tried to control the aftermath. Cleopatra was buried with honors, not out of respect but necessity. A woman who ruled Egypt for 2 decades could not be erased overnight. Rome reframed her story quickly, decisively. She became temptation, excess, moral failure.
The empire warned its citizens not to look too closely. When history reduces a ruler to a vice, it avoids examining the method. Yet the method survived. Fragments from medical texts hinted at knowledge gathered under royal authority. Religious records suggested rituals that bound loyalty through shared experience. Roman letters revealed admiration hidden beneath outrage. Cleopatra's legacy did not vanish, it dispersed. Ideas travel more easily than armies. Rome absorbed what it condemned, stripping away the goddess imagery and keeping the mechanism. Centuries later, empires would repeat her techniques without acknowledging their origin. Control through environment, loyalty through secrecy, authority through perception. Cleopatra had been ahead of her time, and history punished her for it. Not because she failed, but because she succeeded too visibly. Modern historians argue endlessly about who Cleopatra really was: lover, queen, manipulator, victim of propaganda. The argument itself proves her final victory. She refuses to settle into a single meaning. Rome wanted a warning sign. Cleopatra became a question mark. What the underground chambers revealed was not depravity, but insight. Cleopatra understood that humans are not governed solely by laws or fear. They are governed by belief, by anticipation, by the need to belong to something larger than themselves. She built power where others saw taboo. She turned secrecy into structure. She transformed ritual into leverage.
And when defeat arrived, she applied the same principle one last time. She chose how she would be remembered. Rome wrote its version. Cleopatra left hers in the gaps, in what was burned, in what was whispered, in what feels unfinished even now. That discomfort is her echo, the unease that lingers when a story refuses to close neatly, when history senses it has been managed. Cleopatra did not die powerless. She died undefeated by the narrative. And that is why, 2,000 years later, Rome is remembered as an empire that fell, while Cleopatra remains a ruler history still argues with. Because the most dangerous power is not the one that conquers, it is the one that teaches the world how to remember.